Hi everybody and welcome back to day number 7 of the Conscious Masculinity Intensive. We are almost halfway there, and we still may feel like we're just at the beginning of peeling back the layers on our understanding of gender, masculinity, femininity, and so much more. And it's because this is a lifelong process. And the goal here is to continue to layer in more and more context for you, and then more and more tools for you to get really clear on your gut instinct and what is true for you. That balance between additional external information and greater internal permission to honor your gut feeling about all of this. So yesterday we continued the process of separating our understanding of masculinity and femininity from these binary concepts of gender, separating ourselves from the idea that there's only one way to be a man and one way to be a woman, and that it's either hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine, and that the energies or the qualities we associate with masculinity and femininity are in and of themselves gendered. And I just want to honor the amazing work that you're doing within your minds and your hearts and your souls right now, because this can be a daunting process when we start to realize that we're giving ourselves permission to see something differently, even if it resonates so deeply within us. It's hard sometimes because we step out into the world or we open up our phone and we're again bombarded with information trying to convince us otherwise in very subtle ways. So I just want to honor the work that you're doing to be human beings on this planet who are anchoring a new way of doing things, which in some ways is the old way, as we're going to talk about today. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about two buzzwords that we need to define and contextualize as we think about where did our current understanding of gender come from and how can we move out of it towards one that better serves all of us. And these words are patriarchy and white supremacy. Big ones. So what's important to understand here is that our current model of gender, that traditional gender model that we talked about a few days ago, that idea that if you're born with a penis and testicles, that means that you're a boy, you're going to be a man, you're going to be masculine, you're going to marry a woman, and then vice versa for babies born with traditionally female genitalia. That traditional gender model comes from somewhere, and it's actually only been around for those of us living in Western countries for a couple of hundred years. I'm here in the United States of America, and so I just want to contextualize that that's where I'm speaking from, but any country that has a history of colonization by those original European superpowers, your story is going to be pretty similar to this. And that is that the indigenous people that lived here and lived all over the world had a very different understanding of gender. Obviously, there's quite a lot of cultural variation. Indigenous is not just a monolith identity. But what we saw historically within these cultures was that gender was not even necessarily a concept in the way that it is today. And it certainly wasn't a binary. We see for folks who are still alive today with indigenous roots that they acknowledge often a much wider spectrum of gender expression. So using very different words than what we would use, but allowing space for there to be a man who's masculine, a man who's feminine, a woman who's masculine, a woman who's feminine, someone who is both masculine and feminine, man and woman, someone who is neither. And I'm sure that many of you at this point have heard the term two-spirit, which is an indigenous term describing that experience of being someone housing full masculinity and full femininity, and often externally expressing as a real androgynous blend of male and female. Now, this understanding of gender, or simply humanity, acknowledges the emotional and psychological and spiritual diversity that we find in each and every one of our expression of masculinity and femininity. And it also acknowledges the biological reality that many people are born intersex. Many people do not fall within that male and female binary. And traditionally within many indigenous cultures, particularly those in the Americas, there was room for this. Everybody who was born was honored as someone who could make a contribution to the group. And this is where it's important to note as well that the imposition of gender roles by European colonizers who arrived here was largely about power. Because indigenous communities, non-Western communities, non-imperial European communities had a very different understanding of power. Communities were structured in a much more communal way. Yes, there were people with large amounts of responsibility, often people who were leaders, but power was distributed within the community in very different ways. In many cases, everyone was empowered, everyone was allowed to and encouraged to embody their full power in service of the group and to specialize in what made them unique, because there was that inherent understanding that allowing people to fully self-express and fully embody their power was going to benefit the group overall. And so when European colonizers arrived in the Americas in the 1400s and in the 1500s, there was a concentrated imposition of a new social system that included gender and also race, a system that codified, that organized people, labeled them in new ways so as to better control them. There was the imposition of the European standard of truly what it means to be a man, this masculine archetype, this sense that masculinity is more powerful, that masculinity deserves to be in charge, and then a traditional identity as a woman. And when I say that the European colonizers imposed new gender norms on the indigenous peoples of the Americas and other places, what I mean specifically is that they did this through laws, through the way that they restructured society. Laws like who was allowed to own property, putting property ownership solely in the hands of men. Laws about what kind of marriages were and weren't okay. Lots of indigenous groups had very different ways of organizing their relationships that really reinforced communal responsibility, communal care, not necessarily always looking like polygamous relationships, but sometimes, and certainly even in monogamous connections, there being a much deeper connection to the wider community within that relationship unit. Because the thing about laws is that they restructure the physical lived experience in a way that eventually, over time, erodes the collective memory and shifts how people think about themselves. So gender is a piece of that, that prioritization of masculinity, that idea that to be masculine is to be superior. And this is where we get that word patriarchy, which is basically the idea that men and masculine expression is superior, biologically superior, is designed to be better at controlling and ruling and organizing communities, and is therefore given prioritization, privilege, power, greater access to resources in society. And now this was mediated and is mediated by race in really interesting ways, because if you think about what it means to be an ideal man in that stereotypical way, or an ideal woman stereotypically in that traditional gender model, for a man, you get traits like in control, non-emotional, smart, logical, disciplined. For a woman, you get things like submissive, good in the kitchen, caretaking, polite, right? There's that real curtailing of sexual expression or even outward expression in many different ways. And if you think about when we read out that list, who are we really describing? What we're describing is an ideal white man and an ideal white woman. Because if you were to describe stereotypically what our society still sees, particularly black men and black women as, that stereotypical list of characteristics is almost the opposite of what that ideal man, ideal woman list is. Right? We have these stereotypes that are still on autopilot within our society, that black women are loud, that they're out of control, that they're too sexual. We have those same stereotypes about black men as well, that they're violent, that they're not in control, that they are too emotional, too sexual, all of these different things. And so I encourage you to see how gender and race are inextricably linked here. This model of what it meant to be within this binary in a way that allowed you to succeed and gain power and access in this society was all about giving that power and access to white people as well. And so when we're talking about releasing ourselves from the ideas of the gender binary now and reclaiming a full integration of masculinity and femininity within ourselves in an exalted form of all of those beautiful human characteristics, it's different for those of us who are white versus those of us who are people of color. Because this system was designed to ensure white supremacy. And so that's our second buzzword for today. And I want to be clear, when we talk about white supremacy, one of the manifestations that comes to mind today when we hear that phrase are white people, white nationalists who are organized in very actively proclaiming, celebrating, maintaining their superiority over people who are not white. But Beyond that very extreme manifestation, we have simply a society that is set up to prioritize the needs of white people and to give them greater access and power and privilege in our world. And it starts at the idea of thought, right? Thought is the origin of anything that exists in our external world. So it starts with that idea that the right way to be a human, the right way to have a gender, was the way that was associated with being white. And so you can see here how this sort of matrix of control weaves a pretty in-depth web. So let's just take a deep breath here for a moment and just let this information settle in. For some of you, this may feel like you know it already. For some of you, this may feel really new, and it may feel like you want all the footnotes on this. And I assure you that the resource guide that you're going to get is going to have lots of ways for you to continue to dive into these topics. But these are the context pieces that we need before we go to the next level. Because in the next few days, we're going to begin to talk not just about ourselves, but our communities and our relationships. We're going from that focus on self to how does self interact with lots of different people, and understanding that we live in a world that still is designed, although we are doing quite a lot of work to take it off of this autopilot, is still designed to prioritize and to value whiteness and maleness over the opposite. And this will help us to understand why our relationship to masculinity can feel so confusing and twisted, why there's so much often guilt and shame and weirdness just caught up in it. Because if we look at the origins of the system, it is a system about control and violence and suppression of everybody's authentic self-expression. So of course, there's a lot to unpack here, and there's a lot that we're just carrying in our bodies and our ancestral lineages around the violence that brought us to the point where we felt like we had to act a certain way in order to be accepted. And it helps us to understand the particular confusion and guilt that comes from being male, from being a man, from being someone who feels drawn to a really masculine self-expression, because we've been taught on the one hand that it is the best. It is the way that you need to be, but we've also been taught that it needs to show up in a very particular way and should not be accompanied by any complementary femininity. And we've been taught that it makes us better. And for those of us who are really empathetic, who have that gut instinct to care for other human beings, like there can be that sense of, wait a minute, I don't want to purely self-express in this way if it means that I am aligning myself with something that has led to the repression and the constriction of so many different people. So your homework today is twofold. First, if you're feeling that intellectual curiosity and you want to be learning more about these structures and the origin of our race and gender system today, check out at least one of the resources linked in the email and note how that's expanding your consciousness. And two, and this is the one that I really want you to focus on, is allow yourself to have an emotional reaction to this information. The way the system has been set up is not okay. It has hurt all of us, regardless of what your gender is, regardless of what your lived experience of this lifetime has been. You carry with you the wound of being cut off from different aspects of yourself and therefore cut off from other people. So I want you to check in with yourself and note, what are the emotions that are coming up? Is it shame? Is it fear? Is it guilt? Or is it anger? Or is it sadness? And literally set yourself a timer for as little as 5 minutes to feel the feeling. That may look like writing it out, writing a letter and saying, screw you, Christopher Columbus, this is how I feel about what you did to the way that we relate to each other, right? You might help to personalize it in that way. It may look like simply going into your bathroom and crying in the bath. It may look like literally setting 5 minutes on the timer to punch a pillow or to go to the gym and like work out some of the physical anger that's in your body, and just allowing this to move through you. So often we just go on this intellectual quest where we want to learn more, we want to validate everything that we're learning, we want to really build that intellectual understanding of what happened. But what drives this is often the feelings underneath it, and it's time for us to start feeling some of those feelings. I know for me, I feel a mixture of sadness. I also feel some guilt and some shame because I understand that I am of the lineage of the colonizers, right? A lot of my genetic material, a lot of my ancestors come from England, from Ireland. and from predominantly white countries in Europe. I also feel a lot of anger that I've had to fight to become who I am in this world because of these mistaken ideas. Anger also that other people have been put through generations of curtailing of who they really are. And that anger too of, if I think about my masculinity and my femininity, if I think about my desire to protect and care for people, which is really that balance of masculine and feminine, I feel an anger that I have not been able to protect and care for all of the people who have come before me, who had this experience of being denied full expression of who they really are. So this can feel intense, but nothing is more intense than keeping inside the feelings that we actually need to let out. So give yourself permission for even 5 minutes to have an experience of your reaction to this information, and we'll take it from there. And as always, share in the group and share online if you feel moved to #ConsciousMasculinityCrew. And until tomorrow, I am sending you so much love, and I'll see you back here for day number 8.